Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Community Engagement Series. My name is Priscilla Medeiros. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization and Community Engagement Specialist at the Edwin S.H. Leong Centre for Healthy Children and your moderator for the series. I'm incredibly excited to introduce our panel of speakers for today's webinar. We're joined by a number of members from the Joannah Brian Lawson Centre for Child Nutrition at the University of Toronto. This includes Dr. Daniel Sellen, Director of the Centre and Professor in the Departments of Anthropology, Nutritional Sciences, and the Dalla School of Public Health. He's joined by Dr. Mavra Ahmed, Research Associate at the Lawson Centre and Adjunct Professor at Ontario Tech University, who leads the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds initiative examining school food programs across Canada. Also presenting are Nina Trask and Nicole Weber, research officers at the Centre whose work focuses on school food programs and policies that support healthy and equitable food environments for children and youth. And finally, we're joined by Selena Quibrentar, a researcher at the Centre who leads the Centre's youth engagement strategy. So today's presentation will be drawing on lessons and case examples from their recently completed Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds school food initiative. The presenters will share their experiences about the work before the work, including the foundational relationship building, co-creation of research processes involved, and the trust building within that community space that landed them in a good area with this project. So I'd like to let everyone know who's joining for the very first time to please hold their questions until the end. You're welcome to enter them into the chat, and during the Q&A portion, I will bring those questions to the attention of our speakers. So welcome to everyone, and I'll now pass it off to our presenters for their presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Priscilla, for that very kind of introduction. And thank you also to the Leong Centre for the invitation to present on some of the community engagement work that our teams have been working on over several years recently and continue to do around some of the questions around school food programs in Canada. And so my name is Daniel Sellen. And the team were just kindly introduced by Priscilla. You'll see a number of folks presenting today who are primarily involved in building our relationships around school food program research with a number of different partners and other types of community. And they're going to focus on how we've learned in our journey collectively to build trust and be responsive to community needs and questions around school foods, and have built a particular way of co-creating the design and the way of doing research. So I will give a brief framing to this work, which has gone for several years. Next slide, please. And then hand to the team for the key learnings today. So as Priscilla mentioned, we're based in the Joannah Brian Lawson Centre for Child Nutrition, which is an entity in the Temedy Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. And we focus on sustainably improving child nutrition for long-term health and well-being. And our programs involve a number of training and learning efforts for people in the health sciences, basic research, outreach, and a number of high-level research support events and initiatives. And our vision is to build lifelong health through better nutrition and to mainstream the knowledge that we have on child nutrition into all other sectors of society, starting with the health professions, and to keep child nutrition clearly in view as a foundational input for human well-being. So we do a number of things, including supporting research, education, and increasingly policy. And we have very carefully developed strategic plans that focus on identifying clear pathways towards achieving these goals. And those pathways basically always require three basic foundational guides to be present: building capacity, that can be people, connections, and engagement, as we'll hear today, focusing on changes in practice, both in the medical professions and in all other relevant sectors, and also empowering advocates for child nutrition to tell their story more effectively to protect and create change and promote child nutrition well-being. So I mentioned this because the project you're going to hear about is nested within that set of approaches at the Lawson Centre. And we're going to hear some details about a program that ended last year called Feeding Kids, Nourishing Minds. You can find more information about it on our website at the Lawson Centre. There's a QR code here. There are many publications already resulting from this work. And I mentioned this because the projects we'll hear about today are very impactful and connected to a wider family of activities that continue across Canada. Next slide, please. So as you've heard, we'll be hearing from key people here, Dr. Mavra Ahmed, who built the conceptual framework for the suites of studies that we've done in this space. Nina, Selena, and Nicole have led specific engagement tracks as our work has developed over several years. My key point here is to mention that we have an interdisciplinary research team, of which the people you hear from today are just a few of the many members. During the life of the Feeding Kids, Nourishing Minds project, which began with a donation to the Lawson Centre back in 2019 before the COVID pandemic shutdowns, we've involved more than 40 individuals who've trained or worked with or contributed to the project. And the projects have included studies across Canada that are clinical, high-level data management, and also very community-oriented. And so this work continues, and we will be sharing further work in, I hope, future years that extends from this. Next slide, please. You can find more information about these individuals at the web links that are being placed in the chat, and again at the Lawson Centre. So I'll mention now very briefly our agenda for today's session. We're going to talk about the background, the research context. I mentioned already this Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds research initiative, and particularly we'll be looking at the impact of school food program study, which has emerged in the last year as a follow-up funded piece of work. And the point about this is this work has been ongoing now for more than 6 years and continues strongly into the future. And a big piece of why that has been possible and why we have strong momentum and widespread support for the value of this research is through the very community engagement that you're going to hear about, which again is an ongoing process. So what we're going to share, or the team is going to share, is some of the strategies and lessons that we've learned about doing this in a way that's made our work valued and increasingly called upon in school foods, specifically how to build the relationships and to reciprocate in partnerships, how to deepen the engagements for co-creation, and how to tailor the approaches. As you'll hear, there are many great guides on how to do this, but we did not follow any particular prescriptive framework. And instead, we took a lot of training and direction from many wonderful resources, which the team is going to share with you, and then tailored them to what was happening in real time as the project unfolded. And the last thing we'll really want to emphasize is the importance of remaining humble, open-minded, and flexible in the way you approach collaboration. From my perspective, as a very seasoned scientist, I've learned over my career in many community engagement contexts that the worst thing you can do as a researcher is enter with questions that you've already preconceived and are very wedded to and reluctant to modify or change as you approach an area that you may have training and interest in. And it turns out there are often very different and much more relevant questions that are the ones that will be most widely consumed by knowledge users. And communities will guide you to what those questions are. And so this sometimes feels like a problematic space for researchers trained in a more traditional way, that somehow by doing engagement, changing your approach, shifting your questions, you're losing your ability to serve as a researcher. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You become more relevant. And so with that, with the last slide, before I hand to Dr. Ahmed, next slide, please. I just wanted to give you, again, a sense of the time frame here. So our project began back in 2020 for real, and we had to have a conceptual framework. One of the interesting things is we were invited to this work by one of the major funders of school food programs prior to the recent federal announcements, who wanted to understand what programs worked, which kids were being missed or well served, and if they were working, how, and if they weren't, why not? And so we had to build a conceptual framework from the beginning and figure out from the ground up who would be the existing experts, partners, stakeholders, and knowledge users, and what was currently and not known in Canada and beyond. So that took a couple of years to sort out, and Dr. Ahmed led a lot of this work, as you hear. And by 2022, we'd actively developed many of the analytic approaches, and we'd built our team, we'd found talent, we were building our research capacity through a number of funded activities. But what we didn't have was engagement. And so here's my last point. In the period of 4 years, from 2022 to the current year, a lot of engagement was done, and that really enhanced the output from the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds initiative. It realized the conceptual frameworks. It created actual knowledge that is now being used by policymakers, by schools, by school food program implementers, and many others. And it also surfaced a number of key capacity gaps across Canada in this space. And it led to new interest and new funding. Currently, this team is working on new projects, including one that we call Empowering Kids Informing Policy, where we're translating many of these findings from community engagement into knowledge use. So with that, I will hand to my colleagues, beginning with Dr. Ahmed. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that intro and overview, Dan. So I'm just going to jump right in. So when we started this project, there was minimal evidence assessing the patchwork of school food programs in Canada. Therefore, the Feeding Kids Nourishing Minds initiative comprehensively evaluated the Canadian school food environment as well as the school food program, including the impact on students' achievement and health outcomes and dietary intakes, which will be the focus of today's presentation. This is just a quick overview how we incorporated several different methodologies, including systematic rapid reviews, focus group surveys, prospective cohort designs, and co-creation to landscape the existing school food program and understand program resiliency and understand stakeholder and engagement as well as their perspectives, and look at or gauge the impact of SF, school food programs and students themselves. Next slide, please. As I mentioned today, what's highlighted in that red box right there, we will be looking at assessing the impact of school food program modalities on students' intakes, achievement, and well-being. And this study mainly focuses on community engagement. So that'll be what we'll discuss today. Just keeping in mind, when we think about school food program, it's important to consider not just the outcomes, but how those outcomes are shaped through meaningful community engagement. So for example, when we collected data on dietary intakes, we wanted to understand, of course, how these programs reflected students' cultural preferences and lived experiences. When we're thinking about nutrition knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, we're thinking about, well, how do we co-develop these particular tools and then translate them into really enhancing nutrition knowledge, attitudes, and behavior, making them more relevant and actionable. Therefore, I'm pleased to say that our team will be discussing this further today as well. So next slide, please. I'll just continue in terms of the timeline from what Dan presented earlier. In 2023, we focused on early relationship and partnership development with Toronto District School Board, alongside submitting ethics applications to both the University of Toronto and Toronto District School Board. And this phase was really the time where we built trust and laid the strong foundation for the work. In 2024, once we received the approval, we formally launched a pilot study and creation of the Project Advisory Committee to help us guide the research and ensure it remained grounded in our stakeholder perspectives and co-creation methods. And in 2025, we moved full into implementation, conducting the study across the 12 schools in Toronto District School Board. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the studies. This study was designed to better understand not just, looking at whether the school food programs work, but also the impact of school food program modalities in different ways on students' dietary intakes, achievement, and well-being. So we collected student outcomes, including mental health and well-being, physical activity, nutrition knowledge, attitudes, behavior, dietary intakes, learning skills, and academic achievement. So there's quite a few outcomes that we collected in that, as well as we collected data on program implementation, including infrastructure, resources, staffing, equipment, and also data on school food program coordinator perspectives. This is a comprehensive mixed methods approach study. I would say we assessed a range of outcomes. We're using different methodological approaches, including service, interviews, plate waste, food record, school, and student data. And we partner with, of course, Toronto District School Board, but alongside we also had Toronto Public Health and Toronto Foundation for Student Success to help us guide our questions and our data collection, ensuring the research remained grounded in practice and policy realities. I think it's important to highlight how this was quite a comprehensive study, and we were quite successful across a number of participants, including 12 schools, 307 students, 150 parents, and 15 school food program coordinators. And with that, I'll pass it over to our next presenter. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mavra and Dan, for kind of setting up the background of who we are and how this project came to be. The rest of the presentation is really going to focus on how we did various aspects of community engagement. And I'm really going to focus right now on that core work about the relationship building before the study actually launched. So as you can see from the title, we're talking about the transition from building relationships into formal project partnerships and the work before the work. So what we're thinking when we say the work before the work is really that community engagement should begin before the study begins. So you're forming these relationships and connections with those in the community before trying to work with that particular community. And this can look different across a variety of projects or settings. For us, it looked like we are people who work in school food research. We had made previous connections with the Toronto District School Board in some of our earlier projects. If you think about that page that Mavra showed earlier with the different boxes of our projects, some of those had kind of touched base with Toronto already. So we had existing relationships and connections there. And then we actually had one of our relationships reach out to us and say, you know, we've identified some community priorities. I think this aligns with the work you do. Are you interested in working with us? And so that pre-existing relationship was really, really important. And then I'll talk a little bit more about how much more time we then put on top of that to further develop that relationship and establish a true partnership in this project. The next point I want to make is about not rushing relationship building and acknowledging that it takes time. This would probably be one of our largest learnings as a team, was that the timeline we had established really wasn't relevant when the project came into working with community and seeing what timelines we actually needed to adhere to. So just a tip for when you're thinking about community engaged research is anticipate the relationship development phase, build that into your project timelines, and give it some wiggle room because it's probably going to look different than you initially anticipated. One of the frameworks I really want to call attention to is working in good ways. We actually came upon this framework later on, so we didn't use this framework in the study that we're talking about today, but as we kind of worked further in some Indigenous and cultural training, we came across this framework by the University of Manitoba and some really awesome community engagement researchers there. They put this framework together and it talks a lot about things that really resonated with our team and what we ultimately ended up doing in our own trial and error. A lot about reciprocity, relationship building, things like humility and literacy. So being aware of what your community is. So community literacy is like knowing the community, being familiar with it, reflecting, thinking about your role. Why am I here? Why do I want to seek this partnership? What am I bringing to the community? So a lot of self-reflection and legitimate, genuine relationship building is the foundation of community engagement. And one of those key kind of terms that we have been coining and using amongst our own team is this idea of an anchor relationship. Quite literally someone that tethers you to the community or a group of people that help really anchor you into that community that you're trying to work with. They really can help broaden your community connections and shape your research. And they're kind of like that core of the team that you're engaging with. So I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. But before we switch to the next slide, I do just want to recognize that this cover art is done by Nikki Furland, who is one of the authors on the Working in Good Ways framework. And just again, that's a resource to share with you, not necessarily one that we followed. We really very much had an iterative process here. Okay, great. So for our anchor relationships, and I know Mavra kind of touched on this and Dan as well, that we worked very closely with the Toronto District School Board specifically for this project. Two of our main anchor relationships was the ERRC and the NLOs. The ERC is the External Research Review Committee. They're basically what every school board has, which is a group of staff who filter in research applications from external groups. So us coming from U of T, they're going to approve or deny our research proposals, and they'll help us be in alignment with with the Toronto District School Board's ethics, protocols, and school and community priorities. So by having this relationship with the ERC, which again was kind of formed based on previous work and then expanded on through this project, they really gave us that ethical backbone and institutional approval within the school board. So by having them as core partners, by working with them through every phase of the ethics application, of designing the study, of communicating with our partners, we had that institutional trust from their own system, and we weren't coming in as much as outsiders, and we were working with the system of that community and following, their approval processes, their ethical standards. So that was a really important part of entering into the community under trusted existing systems. And that's something an anchor relationship can really do for you, is it helps you build credibility while creating these pathways for collaboration. The next partner that I really want to talk about is the NLOs, and these were essential to our work in the community and actually connecting with each individual school. The nutrition liaison officers, basically their role is that they help schools. So each of them have a region of the TDSB. They serve dozens of schools each to help them implement their school food programs. And so they're that kind of like deeply involved in community, already respected, intimate knowledge of the programs and the schools. And they really helped facilitate introductions with the schools, awareness of the programs, and so many components of our study design. So basically from this slide, the main thing to understand is these relationships, when fostered and nurtured and clarified, can filter into partnerships. And from those partnerships, we were then able to collaborate and coordinate the research study, as well as gain clear pathways into the community. So they facilitated those introductions and trust. And one thing I want to flag, if you look at the Working in Good Ways framework too, and we found this to be true, is that the relationship doesn't automatically equal a partnership. Right? So you're in that relationship for trust and mutual respect take time to build, and that's not necessarily going to immediately translate into a partnership. So be mindful of what expectations you're coming in with, what assumptions you're making, and what the real purpose and value of those relationships are. Some key considerations obviously are trust and mutual respect. And as we've said a bunch of times, if you think about a real relationship in your life, outside of research, outside of work, trust and respect take time to build, and they are earned. It's not something you're automatically entitled to, especially in a community setting. So honoring the fact that takes time, and that you need to ensure that they know that you're coming from a good place and they're working in a good way with their systems. Like Dan said at the beginning, not necessarily coming in with your preconceived notions, agendas, and questions. The next one is balanced power dynamics. We really flipped the power dynamic on its head. We weren't coming in as like experts here to extract information. We wanted to learn from the community. We wanted to understand the community and their priorities. And so we really made sure that it was very clear that we weren't coming with our own agenda and telling everyone how it was going to go. We actually asked a lot of permission. We clarified, we were flexible. And we were very transparent throughout the whole process about what we could do, but what we hoped to do, and about truly what was outside of our capacity. And that'll come up as a bit of a theme throughout the rest of the presentation. I'll go to the next slide, just in the interest of time. There's so much we could talk about these anchor relationships, but I'll jump into kind of what we actually did once these partnerships were formed. So moving from relationship to partnership to now, okay, we have this solid partnership. We're in alignment on the questions. We've kind of conceived of this project together. Then we learned that our timeline was too tight still. We couldn't just jump right into the full study. We needed more time to talk to the schools, to practice, to trial some of the data collection methods. So we ended up piloting the study, and we worked with 3 schools and our key partners of NLOs and ERC. We made decisions with them that helped to refine the study design. It tested the feasibility. And from the pilot, we actually threw out a feedback survey as well. So we got community feedback from parents, from students, from principals, and we said what worked for you and what didn't work for you. And that way we could learn as we were going into the full study, maybe what else needed to change in the study design. And I want to flag again, you'll hear this again and again, a lot of time. So this piloting and additional conversation added a year to our collaborative work prior to the full study. So that was, again, a new learning for us where we really had to shift our timelines. We made good use of this year, though. We continued to nurture our relationships and partnerships. We formed what Mavra mentioned earlier, the Product Advisory Committee, or PAC as we call it. And this made it so that our anchor relationships could extend us to the rest of the community. We got voices from teachers, from school food program coordinators, from superintendents and other board members. And so now we weren't just listening to our core relationships, but we had expanded to hear voices from the community to help inform every aspect of the project. And then finally, within this time period, we also would attend whatever events we were invited to. This is like another key part of community engagement, is to actually be present and show up for events that might not be explicitly linked to progress on the project. We showed up to appreciation events, to various meetings. It made our faces and our project more known in the community, and we actually got to know the people doing the work, which was really beautiful for us actually ourselves as well. It's a really important part of the process, is to actually just show up in the community. And finally, that kind of led to us co-creating the full study. So when I say co-create, I mean in this project, everything from the design, from the research question to the design, to the timelines, all of our recruitment strategies. And then this is where I'm going to end off on the next 2 slides, focusing, is it really trickled down into school level coordination. So we went from community engagement broadly with the TDSB into really specific engagement with the school communities that we were going to be working with in the study. And I'll go to the next slide. We'll kind of wrap up here, and then I'll pass it off to Selena. I have two more slides. So when we got to that level of school level community engagement, we had a lot of partnerships and considerations for school recruitment. So what we actually did was, with the PAC and specifically with the NLOs, we knew we had to be really collaborative in how we recruited schools. We'd done school research before, and there can be a lot of red tape and a lot of just communication or capacity barriers to getting into schools. So we worked with the NLOs, we developed this eligibility criteria and purposive sampling methodology that really made sure we got a good spread of program types, of socioeconomic backgrounds, of school types, and things like that. And then we identified prospective schools and agreed on an outreach plan together. And this is where the community partnering really, really helped in our achievement of the project, because the NLOs knew the principals, they knew the program coordinators, they knew the schools. So they could make that initial outreach email and say, hey, are you interested in this study? We're working with this group. Here's what it's all about. And if they were interested, then we reached out to the principals to have that further meeting with our team. But it meant that we weren't coming in as outsiders. We weren't coming in as some unknown entity. We were vouched for, we were vetted, and we were in partnership with people in their community. So there was that established trust there. The last thing I want to mention on this slide, if you look at the graphic on the right-hand side, we kind of included things like the classroom, the school food program, the calendar, the student population, your partnerships, and different points of access that you have to consider. So there's lots of thinking ahead being done by our team. We're constantly discussing with each other, how are we going to conduct research in different school settings? How are we going to navigate these different relationships and different approval processes? And we landed on these 3 takeaways that might help you in your community engaged work. Plan to diversify. Anticipate that you're going to have different strategies for conduct in these different areas. Schools and other community groups are not a monolith. You're going to have diversity within that community that you have to consider. Be transparent about your aims, capacity, and limitations. That should be very clearly communicated so that you're not over-promising and under-delivering, or that there's no misalignment between your objectives and the community's priorities. And then engage in regular dialogue with partners and participants to make sure that we remain on the same page. And then I'm tight for time, so I'm just going to go to the next slide, and this will be my last one, and I'll pass over to Selena. We wanted to give a little case example of what it might look like for tailoring the approach at the school level. The example that I'm going to talk about is those early orientation and planning meetings when we were first recruiting schools and planning. And then Selena's going to dive into some more specific examples of how did we tailor the approach for the actual implementation of the study. So in this example, we had school level planning meetings. So after the NLOs reached out to those principals, they said, yes, we're interested. We coordinated this meeting where we had the NLOs, our team, and the school leadership present. We would explain the study. That's kind of what this first image on the top left is. We'd explain, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why might it be important for your school? If they were still interested at that point, we then started to ask about their school. Tell us about your school food program. Tell us about your school. What are some unique things we should be considering? And we'd also discuss core communication pathways. This was really important for identifying who do we need to keep in the loop, who absolutely has to be CC'd on things with approval processes, who's the person that we can reach out to for a quick question, really nailing down those things so that we weren't bothering the community or going through inappropriate channels of communication. And then the last one I really want to offer is a kind of a template for something that we did to co-create our plans. So let's say the example that I have here on the slide is participant recruitment for students. In this meeting, we would bring up this table on a slide and we'd say, okay, these are the group of students 1 to 3 and 4 to 8. We're trying to do these types of data collection. These are the numbers that we've, figured out that we need. And these are some of the ideas for how we could go about this. But then we left the farthest panel blank so that we could have that discussion with the principals and with school leadership to see how would this work best in your school. Here's some of our ideas. Here's what we can and can't do. Let's make this work together. And so that's where I'll wrap it today, but just a lot of really intentional relationship building and then very, very detailed collaborative planning to get to where I'll pass off to Selena, which is the actual data collection and implementation for the study. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nina. So in the next few slides, I'll be sharing how we built and sustained relationships throughout the study. As you know, community buy-in is essential to research, and so without participant engagement, a study simply cannot move forward. And so it can create significant challenges and delays for the project when recruitment is unsuccessful or interest is low. And so for that reason, our team really prioritized recruitment strategies that were flexible, responsive, and tailored to both school and community contexts. And so here on this slide, I have some examples of how we recruited participants, which included parents and caregivers, as well as students. One of the ways that we recruited participants was members of our project team actually visited schools directly. And so during these visits, we presented an overview of the study to different classes. We distributed consent forms, showed a short informational video, and created space to answer questions from staff and students. And so being physically present allowed us to build trust and address concerns in real time, which is a lot harder to do online if you were just to send recruitment materials to schools and to parents. Another way that we engaged with recruitment is we attended parent council meetings. So we recognized that parents were key partners in the project. Students couldn't participate if their parents didn't give them permission. And we had opportunities where we were invited to attend parent council meetings. So we had a 10-minute block of time where we shared a short presentation and simple information on what the study was about. In addition, we created posters that were displayed throughout participating schools. And so each poster included a QR code linking to a sign-up survey, which offered an accessible and low barrier way for interested participants to learn more and get involved. And so throughout this recruitment process, we worked closely with the project advisory committee and the nutrition liaison officers, and we consulted directly with them, as well as the school administrators, to ask what recruitment strategies would work best in their specific school context. And so rather than relying on a single approach, we embraced a process of trial and error. We adjusted our methods based on feedback and participation patterns, just to ensure that our recruitment efforts remained inclusive, effective, and responsive. Next slide, please. And so throughout the project, we responded to school community needs by making participation easier. So project implementation looked different across the schools because we knew that each school had its own context, structure, priorities, and constraints. And so from the beginning, we knew that a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't work. And flexibility was essential to ensure that the project could align with each school's realities while still meeting the study requirements. And so as the study progressed, we also had to respond to emerging needs that became clear during implementation. And so one example of this was the length and complexity of the consent form, which was identified as a barrier to participation by school communities. And so while we weren't able to revise the consent form completely and shorten it due to TDSB and U of T ethics requirements, we adapted our approach in other ways. So we developed short instructional and informational videos that explain the study and the consent process in a more accessible and engaging format. And so these videos sort of help to break down complex information into manageable pieces and allow participants to review the consent form at their own pace. So in addition to the instructional video for the consent form, we also did it for specific project components, such as the food records. We had these supplemental instructional videos created after the project advisory committee identified that students might need additional guidance for that aspect of the project. And so these videos were designed to reduce burden, improve understanding, and also support students in completing study activities with confidence. And so overall, these adaptations allowed us to remain responsive to school community needs and reduce participation barriers while also maintaining alignment with required protocols. Next slide, please. So building on the importance of adaptive designs, I really want to emphasize here how important it is to be responsive to barriers to participation. So for example, during the study, the parents had to complete a survey, and we noticed that the parent survey completion was lower than anticipated. And so when this happened, we paused to review participation patterns rather than pushing forward with the same approach of consistently reminding parents and caregivers to complete their survey. And so through reflection, we identified that language accessibility was a key barrier for many families. And so in response to this, we developed short, plain language newsletter blurbs that clearly explain how to access and complete the parent survey. And to make this as inclusive as possible, the material was translated into English and 17 additional languages that were identified by the 12 schools that we are working with. Who they mentioned all like the predominant languages other than English that were spoken at those schools. So we shared these materials with the school principals and asked them to share it in their monthly school newsletters. And to reduce the burden even further on schools, we provided language-specific files so that each school could easily select the versions that were most relevant to their community. And so this approach allowed us to provide information about the study to families through a trusted and familiar communication channel in a language that also reflected the diversity of the school community. And as a result, we did see a measurable increase in parent survey response rates. And this essentially demonstrates how small but responsive adaptations can improve participation. Next slide, please. And so this slide focuses on accountability structures that we put in place to support engagement throughout the project. Strong engagement doesn't happen automatically, and it requires intentional structures for communication, coordination, and accountability. And so as projects become increasingly complex, like how our project became really busy, these structures are what helps maintain consistency and alignment and trust across all the partners. So some of the examples of this was regular touch points throughout the project to support shared decision making. And so we've met with the project advisory committee regularly to share updates on project processes, challenges, successes, and to gather feedback as decisions evolved. And so these discussions really helped ensure transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement throughout the study. And in addition to this, we had frequent and ongoing communication with the NLOs. So that involved regular check-ins, often during the school visits when we had to be on site. And this really helped us remain aligned with the school context and schedules. And having these frequent conversations also allowed for timely problem solving and coordination and strengthened implementation and responsiveness at the school level. And so together, all of these accountability structures really helped create a shared understanding of roles, priorities, and expectations, and supported meaningful engagement throughout the project rather than just at isolated time points. Next slide, please. I now want to show you a case example of what accountability structures can look like. So during the project, we presented flexible opportunities for deeper engagement within our accountability structures, such as the project advisory committee. And so beyond those regular touch points, we wanted to create ways for partners to engage more meaningfully in parts where they felt they could contribute most effectively. And so to do this, we established a small focused working group that allowed the project advisory committee members to participate in a naturally occurring focus group working group. And so what a naturally occurring focus group is, it's a teacher-led in-class interview. So rather than researchers asking the questions in an unfamiliar place, we had teachers be the interviewers in a familiar place for students, such as the classroom. And so this working group was designed to co-design a core section of the study. And so together with teachers, we integrated the curriculum connections directly into the focus group to ensure that the research activities were aligned with the classroom learning objectives. And so throughout this process, we also recognized that not all students would want to participate in the focus group. So we developed alternative classroom activities so that all the students could be meaningfully engaged without feeling pressured to participate. And so on the right here, we have an image of what one of these activities looked like for the grade 1 students. And And so the naturally occurring focus groups themselves were collaboratively designed with teachers and led by teachers. And some of the outputs of this working group included lesson plans and classroom ready materials that could be easily integrated into existing teaching plans. And so these resources were designed to be low burden and supportive, while also strengthening the quality and consistency of the data collected. And next slide, please. And so in the last slide, I just wanted to shed light on how we used multiple communication channels to support ongoing engagement throughout the project. Early on, we recognized that email alone was often, like, it wasn't a sufficient, it was an insufficient effective communication strategy, especially in the busy school environment. And so meaningful engagement required flexibility and a willingness to communicate in ways that worked for our partners rather than relying on a single conventional channel for each one. And so we worked closely with all of our community partners involved and educators to identify communication methods that were both preferred and accessible. And so based on this input, we used a combination of communication methods, whether that was text messaging, phone calls, Zoom meetings, in-person visits, email, and all of these methods were used to maintain consistent communication. And so this approach was particularly important when coordinating the implementation of the naturally occurring focus group. The planning of the naturally occurring focus group required detailed planning at the school and classroom level, and it just simply wasn't feasible through email alone. And so to support this process, we held multiple meetings and different methods with teachers using a naturally occurring focus group template just shown here on the screen. And then we also just remained flexible in communication and scheduling to accommodate the different classroom contexts and timelines. And so now I'll pass it over to Nicole to wrap up our presentation today.
Thank you so much, Selena. Here, I'll just click to the next slide. So up to this point, we've heard from both Nina and Selena about how to build and sustain those relationships throughout the study, through engaging those anchor relationships and networks, as well as through co-creation and adapting to different community contexts. But what happens when those approaches are not enough, when we've reached the limits of appropriate adaptation? So I'll now share a brief example from our recruitment phase that became an important learning moment for us about when to pivot, particularly in those critical moments when engaging those community partners. So to start an example, it begins with our anchor relationships or partners, as we identified in Nina's section as the nutrition liaison officers, and they supported us with our recruitment of interested schools that met our criteria, inclusion criteria. And so there was a strong interest identified by our NLOs to include schools primarily serving Indigenous students or those offering Indigenous-focused school food programming, as these were really notably comprehensive programs to learn from. So they connected us with Indigenous education leadership so we could explore this together. And while we anticipated the need to tailor our approach to Indigenous contexts, as well as in considerations to Indigenous research and ethics, we were unsure about what level of adaptation would be required. However, through those discussions, it became quickly clear that our study design was not suited to Indigenous school contexts. Despite that initial interest in work to include them, truthfully, the study wasn't designed to meaningfully understand Indigenous specific outcomes. And truthfully, more importantly, as emphasized by our Indigenous partners, it lacked Indigenous perspective and involvement from the outset of the co-creation process for the study. So continuing in that direction would have risked tokenistic inclusion and engaging in instructive approaches rather than ethical reciprocal engagement, given the lack of, again, meaningful alignment, representation, and Indigenous leadership in the study. So at this point, there were several options in the discussion of whether we created a separate arm of the study specifically for Indigenous-focused schools, or step back and recognize that this is work that would require more dedicated future effort. So again, throughout this decision-making and this discussion we were having, we were very transparent as a research team about our limitations and about what our study could realistically support, recognizing that we feasibly probably couldn't do a separate arm of this current study, and again, doing so would not address that lack of meaningful engagement from the outset. So in alignment with our partners and Indigenous education leadership, we chose not to proceed at this stage. And because of this, we truly were able to maintain strong the trust and actually build a relationship in a way that actually that initial contact with the Indigenous leadership led to a future anchor partner or anchor relationship. so that way we can actually think about moving into, in the future, more culturally aligned work that's grounded in Indigenous leadership and school community self-determination. But in the interim between this, as a research team, we actually undertook additional preparation. So this included learning from Indigenous research approaches, as well as engaging in learnings for Indigenous cultural humility and safety training, data sovereignty training, to really support more respectful, reciprocal, and responsible engagement with Indigenous communities, and such as the working in good ways training that Nina mentioned earlier. So this experience really made us think about what it means to expand relationships, not by doing more, but doing it more thoughtfully over time. So building from this experience, we have here a few principles that we learned while navigating and evolving our community relationships. With the first being to recognize study limits. Not every partnership is a right fit for every study. And part of doing this work responsibly is being honest about when there is an alignment or capacity. That means avoiding overextending or adapting in ways that risk superficial inclusion, including it points to the need for more work before the work, taking that time to build relationships, understand priorities, and to do really that necessary preparation I mentioned earlier in terms of cultural safety and data sovereignty training to really ensure that the foundation is there right from the start. Second is truly as humble and responsive decision-making. So this involves listening carefully to discomfort, tension points, or feedback from partners, and being willing to pivot, defer, or redesign when needed to ensure that alignment with community priorities and needs. And again, these decisions shouldn't happen in isolation. They should be made collaboratively, transparently, as we aim to do in this case example. And finally, sustaining relationships. Partnerships don't begin and end with a single project and a community-engaged research. And the way the project evolves can look very different from where it started. So even when a study doesn't move forward, keeping that dialogue open and continuing to engage those anchor partners helps maintain that trust and create spaces for future more aligned work. And this also means meeting your community members where they're at, being very flexible in how you engage and how often, and checking in when you can so that they know you're there and ready when they are. And I think to emphasize something that has been said across this presentation is this community engaged work takes time, and strong partnerships are built and sustained over the long term. So in this phase, in terms of expanding our partnerships became about, again, less about doing more and doing it right, protecting trust, aligning with community priorities, and building towards that stronger, more co-created work over time. So then I'll now just wrap up what we've heard and what we've learned from our experience for everyone today. And again, it's just first start with relationships before the research even begins. Building the trust of those anchor partners and existing networks is essential. And we really want to enter those trusted spaces rather than approaching communities solely as researchers, but helping to shift that dynamic towards something more collaborative. And importantly, it creates the conditions for partners to meaningfully co-create how the research unfolds. Again, taking that time piece at the beginning. And then second is to really adapt through ongoing partnership. Engagement doesn't stop once the study starts. It requires continuous learning and flexibility. This means tailoring your approaches to different community contexts, having responsive designs, learning from partners and adjusting along the way, and ensuring that the decision-making is shared throughout the process, not just the beginning, through those accountability structures that Selena mentioned. And lastly, through protect through trust and transparency and humility. So this includes being clear about our capacity and limitations and recognizing when a study design is not appropriate for a particular context. In these moments, it's important to work with the partners to decide where to pivot, defer, or redesign, always with the goal of maintaining trust and supporting for that future relationship and future opportunities for collaboration. And at its core, it's again that this work reminds us that community engaged research is not just a one-time process. It's a relationship that evolves over time, and revisiting that cycle that Nina mentioned in her section is that, really when we're looking at engaging community members to shape the study, it's that ongoing and it's iterative and it's continuing both within the project that we're showing today, but also across future work. And so I just overall want to thank everyone for their time and attention. And we really look forward to connecting with anyone after this as well. And we'd be more than happy to take questions about our work.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters today. It was an absolutely incredible presentation, and I'm sure you could have continued unpacking just the wholesome amount of work that went into this said project. and the great deal of effort that went into ensuring that it was authentic and meaningful to all those that were involved. At this time, I'd like to ask our audience members, if you do have any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hands. You're also welcome to add your questions to the chat. I'll certainly keep an eye open and raise those questions to our presenters. Rhaenyra, feel free to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Priscilla, and thanks to this whole team. That was absolutely excellent, and I'm sure you're really proud of that work. I do have a question. So I really like what you said about keeping the partnership going beyond this single project. But I also wonder if you've considered all the knowledge that you've generated that perhaps isn't directly related to your project. So what I mean by that is, obviously you've learned a lot about these school food programs. Obviously you've learned a lot about community engagement, but I think you've learned a lot of other things that could be really beneficial to the schools. For example, the fact that you needed letters translated to 17 different languages. And so the first thing I'm thinking is, do the schools do that themselves? I'm sure they need to interact with parents on a number of issues. Are they doing that? Are they supported in doing that? Because that's critical. And then even all the different communication channels that you learned that need to be used in order to reach the parents. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about brokering the other pieces of knowledge that you've generated and sharing that above and beyond this specific topic of your project.
Thanks, Rhaenyra. Well, I'll just jump in very quickly and offer to the rest of the team. The answer is yes, and actually, this is a great question and allows us to kind of address the fact that in this type of approach, you always end up with collateral information and knowledge that at first sight doesn't seem to really fit the usual things we think of as data for publication and tracking of relationships in the world. And yet we often find, and we were actually just having a conversation yesterday in a slightly different domain around a current piece of work where there's little bits of holdup happening. And we were figuring out what to do. And without going into those details, we were like, oh, well, we actually have a lot of information already that could feed back into some course correction ideas that we would take back to different players in our group there. So yes, we've found multiple times that the sort of soft knowledge that comes on board and often gets pushed around, not just coming to us as a research group, but flows through the research engagements that you've heard about between different actors. And that can often be quite useful in making decisions, changing the emphasis, finding where there might be new resources to help fill gaps that are being met. And sometimes you can create stories that are very useful for bringing more engagement or helping with advocacy or voicing unheard perspectives or revealing unmet needs. So these are things that we've habitually now come to try to take notes of. And I often find myself saying to myself and others on the team, yeah, let's keep a number of side notes going on some of the things we've found ourselves talking about here, because those could be helpful. And so that's a general answer to this great question. And I think you only find these soft data when you take these kinds of approaches. If you use the more kind of systematic, limited ways of filtering data, you by definition are excluding all kinds of things that might be relevant or useful, and you're filtering out all kinds of sort of hidden co-creation that's actually taking place. So this engagement becomes very productive when you stop and look from time to time at what's really happening here, what knowledge is being learned. So with that, I'll open that to others who might have some specifics to share.
Awesome, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I can also answer just specific to when you mentioned like so 17 languages, the schools, did they help us with that? That was actually one of the beauties of working so closely with the schools, was also being able to pull on their resources and capacities. So the TDSB had a language translation service that we were able to use to make sure that when we did those translations, that it wasn't just, Google Translate giving us something. There was a
Mhm.
professional approach to that, which was really, really helpful. And we wouldn't have known of that as an option unless we had had our pack and our connection to the ERC, because they informed us, oh, actually, we do this for newsletters all the time. We can do this for your project. So that was really, really helpful. And I know we need a bit more time for other questions. So the last learning that I'll add on to this is sometimes it actually also revealed to us where there just wasn't, it might have been a community priority that we had multiple languages, but it wasn't something that anyone had full capacity for. So our team didn't have language capacity for all 17, or we know there's many more than 17. And the schools that we were working with themselves didn't necessarily have capacity to adapt to every single participant's native language. So what we ended up doing was we still offered the study largely in English. We had some French accommodations because we do have some French on our team and there's some French schools in the study. But the just changing the language of the newsletter to tell them how to participate was enough of an adaptation that it allowed them to then go to this online survey, because our online survey had, you could click the buttons for it to vocalize the questions. So even if you couldn't necessarily read or write, if you could hear, then you could participate. So it was about kind of like, what adaptations can we do within the capacity that both us and our community partners have? And there was a lot of learning there too. So you'll probably, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but yes, there was many times when the schools helped us achieve something, and then that contributed to future learnings, because we'd be like, oh, we know that system exists. How can we leverage that in the future?
There's other questions, but I will just add the key point, building right off what Nina said, and not just with this project, but many other engagement projects, is that point about there being assets that help with co-creation of knowledge. That if you restrict yourself to an ivory tower idea that we've got knowledge and people like translators and folks who know about certain things, and that's what we're taking to the world, you're completely cutting off possibility and pathways to find all kinds of resource that can be added, like translators and folks who can help with childcare and connect you with rolling recruitments. There are so many ways that one can actually create win-wins with employing local assets to connect with resources like language and many others. And it helps communities voice what they have, use their latent assets, and it helps researchers make more progress in a more effective and actually more cost-effective way. So these are great examples of the kind of two-way street benefits you get by this type of conversation.
Thanks so much for the wholesome conversation, and Rainier, for that great question. You're even populating some ideas in my mind on the work at the center, so thanks for posing that. We unfortunately don't have any more time to take on any additional questions. However, if you do have a burning question or a subsequent question that emerges over the next few days, I invite you to reach out directly to the presenters so that they can respond to any questions you have related to this particular initiative out of their center. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us at the Liyong Center and presenting on the incredible work that they lead. And I imagine there'll be other touch points that our teams will have in continuing to move the momentum in the space of engagement and intersectionality around child health in other ways. So thank you very much for that. I wish you all on the call a wonderful rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you at our next community engagement series. Have a wonderful day, everyone.